Welcome to DMing 102, Storytelling. My name is Shawn Merwin, and I am the seminar coordinator for the Heralds Guild of DMs. We are a volunteer group who are trying to spread the joy of D&D and DMing. We create content for DMs and offer it for free at conventions and game days, as well as online at the Heralds Guild website. The Heralds Guild is sponsored by Baldman Games. Baldman Games offers convention support to companies like Wizards of the Coast at large events like Gen Con. If you are playing organized play events like the D&D Adventurers League at large conventions, there is a good chance Baldman Games is involved. For this seminar, I talk about the joys and challenges of telling a story as the DM in a D&D game.
The very first words of the Dungeon Master's Guide are these. It's good to be the Dungeon Master. Not only do you get to tell fantastic stories about heroes, villains, monsters, and magic, but you also get to create the world in which these stories live. And then the Dungeon Master's Guide goes on to tell you how to create fantastic worlds of heroes, villains, monsters, and magic. What they don't do a great job of doing, and what a lot of these Dungeon Master's Guides or GM advice columns don't do, is tell you how to tell a story when you're sitting at the table. And a lot of us who run published adventures, who run 4-hour slots at conventions, we're not creating the world, we're not creating the adventure, but we are still acting as storytellers. So that's what this is all about. It's about being a storyteller. So that leads us to a question. How do we as Dungeon Masters manage storytelling when we're running a game? We could argue a lot about certain questions, so I want to make two assumptions. The first assumption is D&D is a storytelling or a story creation game. All right? You can play it as a miniatures skirmish kind of game, but at some point, a story is passing back and forth between the players and between the DM, or between the players and the DM and the published adventure. So let's make that assumption. And let's make another assumption that the DM and the players are sharing in that creation. The DM may be presenting a story, but he is also facilitating the player's involvement in that storytelling. If we got those two assumptions set aside, we can continue. No one wants to fight yet?
Bill Gates does.
What's that?
Bill Gates wants to fight.
Well, yes. Apparently. I personally do not endorse any sort of software piracy. It's just me. So let's go back. Let's break it down to the bare basics. What is a story? If you ask a 4-year-old kid, in kindergarten, and I have, what is a story? Basically, you're going to get a very simple answer. Well, story is what happens. And that's it. A story is what happens. But a story is much deeper than that. A story can be anything from an epic saga, a 14-volume expansive story, or it can be just a 3-line paragraph. Something is still happening in that story. So I bring that up because some people say, well, in this little 2-hour adventure that I just bought online and ran, there's not really much of a story. There might not be much of a story, but there is a story. Stories can even be created in the railroad adventure. All right, when we say railroad, you know what I'm talking about, where something happened, you start, and you got to get to point Z because that's where the conclusion is. So you're going to get there no matter what. Yes, it is a railroad. Yes, you might not have a lot of agency, but there's still a story being involved because a story relies on how and when and why as much as just what happens. The story is how the characters interact with what's happening as much as just what is happening. So the players bring their agency to the table no matter what. As a DM, you're going to have 2 tasks. Now, as I say DM in this sense, I'm talking about running a home game. Your first task is to create that game world and the adventures that are going to be played within that world. Now, we're going to probably focus on number 1 in future seminars when we talk about writing adventures or creating adventures on the fly, something like that. But we're going to get to number 2 because a lot of us in this situation are running published adventures. So what we bring to the story, what we bring to the narrative, is that management of the character interaction. We have to make sure they interact with the rules. with the setting of the adventure, with the NPCs within the adventure, and with each other. And we had a great question last about what happens when I have conflict between two PCs. That is just a part of you managing that narrative. So we're going to gloss over real quick creating the game world, because we're not going to focus on it, but let's talk about what the game world brings to a setting. Say you're going to talk about Greyhawk or the Forgotten Realms. You're going to be characters, setting, plots, subplots, action, all that is going to be loaded upon you by that game world. So when you're creating your own, you have to think about those things as well. A game that you run in Eberron is going to be different than a game you run in Dark Sun. When you make that choice, you are already focusing the narrative that you're going to be creating. My voice is powerful. Okay, so like a fiction writer, DMs create or interpret the world along with the other elements. Right? So when you create fiction, every word that you write narrows the narrative down. You're making decisions that are bringing it into focus. Same thing as a DM. As a DM, when you create the world or when you interpret a world that you're already using, you're narrowing down those elements. But unlike fiction writers, those fiction writers have it easy because they get to create their own characters. We don't. The players are going to bring their freaky, broken, horrible, weird characters to your table. They're going to insert them into your story, and that's what you have to manage. So let's take that old question, put it away, bring the new question. How do we help tell a story in our games when we don't have control over the most important part, which are the protagonists of the story, the characters? And if we run published settings and published adventures, we don't even have control of the part that most DMs at home games have control of. We'll look at setting, and if we go through the 3 levels, it'll help us narrow this down. The DM can create their own setting. We have already talked about that. The DM can use the published setting, but can alter them at will. All right, so now you have a little bit more control. But for most of us who are running the games here at Gen Con, we have to operate within an ongoing organized play campaign that we cannot really alter the setting or adventure too much. We're still the DM, and as Chuck told us last time, we're always right. But we have to be always right within a sandbox that's very, very small for us. So now we can get to what the rest of this is going to be about, which is managing the story in the published adventures that we use. The first thing you need to do is understand that setting's atmosphere. You don't have to know the name of the liquor that's served at that one tavern in Waterdeep, but you do need to know what the feel of the region is. Waterdeep is the bustling city. You should know that going into any adventure where you're in Waterdeep. You need to understand the nuances of the adventure's plot and setting. All right? So you might know all about Waterdeep, but this adventure is going to happen. My voice is really powerful. This all might happen in a bandit's lair underneath somewhere in Waterdeep. So now you need to know what is the ecology, if you will, of that lair of bandits as you run the adventure. And as you are running a published adventure, always keep in mind why we like stories. What makes a good story? Story is always about drama. Drama is desire that is foiled by danger. The players all want something. In most adventures, it is just they want to solve the problem that was set to them at the beginning. There may be deeper things about the character that we'll talk about in a bit, but for the most part, figure out what the characters want and figure out how you're going to throw that danger in front of them. Then you've got the drama that you need in the adventure. Only trouble is interesting, as Chuck talked about in the last one. If there are no consequences to failure, there is no reason to even bother failing. So, when you think about how you're going to manage your adventure, think about where the trouble is and push the characters into that trouble as quickly and as often as you can. And for every action, there should be a consequence, especially if that consequence is a failure. We'll talk about this a little bit later. It need not be mechanical, in nature, but it should be at least some consequence, even if it's only narrative, for their failure. That's where some cool stories might be created.
2 levels of storytelling: providing a narrative and facilitating the player's contribution. I'm also fighting my voice.
We're going to alternate words.
Yeah, we are. We are. Because we're both fighting our voices from DMing. Providing the narrative, and I covered this earlier. This is where you describe. This is where you lay out what the characters hear and smell and see and taste and touch and experience. This is the part that sets the scene that the story is going to evolve from. So you take puzzle pieces and you lay them out there for people. And then the facilitating the player's contribution, the players are then going to come back to you and they say, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do this other thing. Each one is a puzzle piece. Each one is going to come together and eventually click together in something new that you're going to take, pull it together, re-narrate it to provide another narrative to once again get the player's contribution to get more puzzle pieces, to re-narrate it. You see how this goes. The 2 levels of storytelling. Your narration, their reaction.
So when you're running an adventure at a convention like this, you usually have about 4 hours to run an adventure. Maybe shorter, might be longer. But what you need to do, and it's not on the slide, but it's the most important thing, is make sure that the players trust you. And you can do this by simply introducing yourself. I've sat at tables before where the DM has just walked up and started. Introduce yourself. Where are you from? Just get that initial level of communication so that the player understands that you are a functioning human being that is not going to come across the table at them during the adventure. Then, after you've given your thing, you've kind of created a social contract. Like, okay, we're going to have fun now. Let them introduce themselves, and most importantly, let them introduce their characters. When they introduce their characters, not only are they telling everyone else at the table the name, the race, the class, that, they're giving you clues about the game that they want to play. If they introduce themselves by saying, my character is Krusk, Big Head of Ogre Town, and I have to... He's a role player. Right? He's not saying my half-orc can do 60 points of damage if I use this feat and this action. If he does that, he's a power gamer. He might break into where his character background is from and start spouting lore about the Forgotten Realms. Okay? Then you know that they're a story-oriented player. Just pick up those clues while they're introducing themselves. They don't know that you're picking their brains for how they want to play, but that's exactly what you are doing. Then you can start to build a story right then that they want to play. Always try to get, and I just use index cards. There's other ways to track it, and sometimes you might not even need all of this information. But if you can usually get their name, race, class, background, and faction, you've got some components that those people that have it easy who write fiction are getting. Because now you can start building those characters for them. And you can see if they're in this faction, they probably have this sort of interest. And in the adventure, even though that faction's never mentioned perhaps, you still know what makes that character tick, and you can start to push a character in that direction. A great thing that 5th edition has brought onto the very front of the character sheet, I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime, are role-playing things. Ideals, personalities, bonds, and flaws. Again, even if you just have them pick one and tell you about them or write it on an index card, you now have a way to bring drama to that character. You have a way to hook that character into the story and get a hint at what that character, what that player wants their character's story to be. If you can get the information on table tents, it's even better, because then it's not just in front of you, but everyone else can see it, this character's name and the faction they're in, and then you might get them interacting with each other in positive ways, which is probably the best thing that you could have. That gives you time to step back, Let the story unfold between them and give your wheels a chance to spin as you put a story together. You want to say the 4 words?
What do you do? This is the point at where you as the DM have made this grandiose narrative. You've laid out all the sight, scent, smell, touch. You have set the scene. You've thrown 1,000 puzzle pieces on the table in front of the character, and you go silent by saying, what do you do? You might say, how do you feel about that? Or do you justify that action? How do you justify that action to you? You're giving them agency. You turn the story over to them.
Yep. What do you do is the gateway for those players to start telling their story. You can expand on that, as Chuck just said, by having them think a little deeper about their character. And as they think deeper about their character, now it's not just the action story, now it's that deeper dramatic story. One trick that you can do is, here's a situation that you see happen every once in a while. They have to convince the king, the players have to convince the king to send troops to a pass to guard it because they know the orc horde is coming. So the bard says, well, I've got this. I've got plus 100 performance, whatever. He goes and he starts his spiel, and he gives a speech that has the players in tears. You're like, this is like bard-worthy stuff. And then the player rolls a 1. And there is this, disconnect now between what just happened and what the role was. So what you can do in situations like that is, if the role is going to completely change the way the narrative is flowing, roll the die first and then have them describe why. So, roll the check. I rolled a 1. Tell me why the king now has you in irons being dragged down into the dungeon. All right. You can step back. You can let the players tell their story, and it becomes a much deeper, richer game because of it. So the 4 things I mentioned earlier that are now on the front of the character sheet, ideals. I'm going to talk about how each one can be used to tell us a better story. Ideals are perfect conflict points. All right. If the paladin's ideal is I will never break the law, you know darn well what's coming. All right. We're going to introduce a law that isn't that great. We're going to see what the paladin does about that. All right. You're making the characters now think deeper, and that expands the story. The personality traits are what you can use to let the character and the player take the spotlight for a bit. If their personality trait is anytime they see a spider, they start running and shrieking, there's going to be a spider somewhere in that adventure, whether it's in the adventure or not. Let them play it up. The bonds. If a character has a bond that they're really attached to, it's on their character sheet, and they tell you, my bond is blank, you're going to have to threaten that bond at some point. You can't always do it in every adventure, but keep it in mind. Keep it in the back of your mind, and if the adventure lends itself to that, bring that bond out, threaten that bond. Now you've got drama. Or you can, a bond is always a place of refuge for characters as well. So if the story plays out where the adventurers are in trouble, you can say, oh, by the way, you get a note from your former master. He says, come, I want to speak with you. Let the story, and then that character can take over. They can retreat, they can take their rest, they can get more information. It makes a cool story. And finally, the flaw. The flaw is often the best thing that a character, because it's usually pretty funny, but it's also usually pretty mechanically relevant. So it's a point of internal conflict for the character, and it's then integral to the story when the flaw becomes part of that thing that's blocking the desire. The flaw itself, the character itself, is its own danger. And when we talk about what's the point that you can give? Inspiration.
Oh, inspiration.
Yeah, my brain does not work sometimes. The inspiration point is the perfect place to let them play their flaw. It makes it harder for them, but then they get the inspiration to make it easier later. Well, we're talking about flaws. Since we have a flaw mechanic now and an inspiration mechanic to draw upon that, create temporary flaws if they come up in the story. So a perfect example is we have to climb this hill to get to the door to the wind temple. All right. make your climb check and make your athletics check. Up they go, I failed. Normally what happens is, okay, you failed, you have to find another way up. Or, okay, let you try again and you succeed. What you can do with a temporary flaw is say, you failed, what happened is you fall, you didn't take damage, but you broke your ankle. So, and you have to approve this with the character, you don't just do it. But have a little discussion and say, tell you what, for the next encounter, since you're on a broken ankle, your movement's reduced by 10. However, here's a pretty inspiration. Or, even though it's against the rule, it doesn't follow the rules, here are 2 inspiration. You're taking this mechanical disablement and you're turning it into something positive that you can use later. That turns a regular adventure of, yeah, we went to the orc cave, into, dude, I just went through that orc cave with a broken ankle, and we kicked butt anyway. Right? And players love to tell those stories. You can also use inspiration as a story carrot. So, again, this is not in the rules, but it is a cool way to bring a story and give the player a little more agency in that story. So if they have an inspiration, they can say, you know what, this is really tough. Can I use inspiration here and bring something that wasn't necessarily in the adventure or something I have into the adventure? So you're handing them a little bit of the narrative, and then they are giving you their inspiration back, but they are able to tell their own story a little bit better. Or vice versa. All right, so something happens and you think, boy, if I could control that character just for a minute as a DM, I could tell a great story. Tell you what, player, let me take narrative control of your character for just a minute. Here's an inspiration. It'll be fun in the long run. Some players, depending on who they are, won't do it. But if they're into role-playing, if they're into that story part of the game, they will let you do that happily. Because they also understand that you as a DM should be a fan of their story. You should want their story to be really, really cool. Consequences don't always have to be mechanical. It doesn't always have to be this. Yeah.
Sorry.
Sure. The comment was it might be better to, since it's step 0 of rules already, which is the DM is always right, the DM can do what he wants, but get that question out there immediately during the social interaction part of your talk with the players. Absolutely. That's the best time to do it. You know, if you let them know that even though you are the DM, you're on their side, you're going to make a story together, most players are more than happy to do that if they trust you. Yep. Make NPCs matter. NPCs are ways to deliver story, and so if you can give the NPCs something that the players can latch onto, they can make it a bigger part of the story, the players will get that story more clearly. One way to do it is, even if it's a very simple NPC, give the NPC a trait. The trait can be something that you deliver through role-playing, a deeper voice, a tick, a twitch, or it can be something that you just describe. I can't even think of a good example, but some way that the players will always remember this NPC just because of the color of their hair. That was much different than anyone else.
I have a really good one that uses this. Those of you who played first season back in Flan, remember Elisanda and the goat? Oh, yeah. The blind goat. Absolutely.
Yep. People who have played those adventures will always remember the little kind of inbred
Yes.
girl and the blind goat, because they were just brought forward. They had a fairly significant, well, the goat didn't, but the girl had a significant part in it, but still, you remember her. And we had players who were like, can I adopt her? And the people who wrote the adventure should see that coming, because if you create an NPC that's that striking, people just gravitate toward it and want to make it part of their story. And the more the PCs like or detest an NPC, the more impact that NPC can have in the story. Again, even if they're not important to the adventure. I always say, what's the one thing for an NPC worse than being hated by the players? Being liked by the players. Because as soon as the players really, really like an NPC, that NPC's days are numbered for sure. You can torture that NPC. You can kill that NPC. Torture first, then kill. and it drives them crazy. Narrating combat is a great way to help get players into the story. The big point is don't overdo it. What you will see sometimes is every swing of the sword, every shot of the arrow, the DM will be, blood splurting here, blood splurting there. You hit the orc right in the eye for 2 points of damage. Save that for those big moments that are very dramatic. You can still describe, sweat pouring down a combatant or things like that, but keep it. You still want the adventure to move forward, so it doesn't have to be kind of this Shakespearean description of every combat. One thing that you can do is if there's a secret somewhere in the adventure, even if that secret is this creature has some sort of resistance, drop hints in that combat narration that will then clue in and prompt the players. If the players can figure out that this creature they're fighting is not resistant. What's the opposite of resistant?
Susceptible.
Vulnerable. Thank you. Vulnerable to fire. You can always have them roll the intelligence or history or whatever check, but if you can narrate that, then they feel really cool when they figure that out on their own. And they could say, yeah, we would have never won, but I figured out that when I shot him with that arrow, that fire thing flared on his, and then I got the Arcana check, and it goes on from there. So do it the cool way rather than just the mechanical way, if you can work it in. Pacing of a story is important, and it's not just the same pace, but it's changing the pace. So maybe while you're role-playing, you're sitting back in your chair and you're talking slowly and everything's nice and smooth. And then after you roll for initiative, you move forward a little bit and you talk a little faster and you start asking for things and you start pointing really quick. Okay, that tenses up the characters. That keeps them involved in that forward-moving story. Whereas if you're sitting back, it gives them more time to think and they're able to reflect on the story they want to tell. Hope versus despair. One of the greatest tools a DM has is to be able to make the players think, we are so dead. There's no way we can get out of here. And then when they do, they feel like that victory is so much sweeter. And it's something that you have to really think about and know the rules well. Because I've had DMs who really pile things on thinking, okay, I'm going to build it up. And then in order to get them out of that situation, they have to obviously fudge. And that kind of sets things off a little bit. So get a more organic feel of hope versus despair if you can. And then information versus action. There's always going to be times when the players need to get information. Don't make that time 30 minutes. Keep it to a 5-minute or 10 minutes at most if you have to. Then get them back in the action. Even if you have to introduce more information later, move back and forth between the two. And you as a DM, you're a narrator, you're also a listener. So try to, if you have a part of the adventure where you're doing a lot of talking, find a way to then ask a question and sit back, let them talk for a while. Controlling initiative is a very important part of storytelling. Use the ability that you have to control the initiative. What I do is if I have 3 kinds of monsters, I'll have the minions, the 2 bodyguards, and then the big evil guy. I will roll 3 initiatives, but I will choose which one goes with which. So I will let the big bad evil guy go first. He gets to do his thing. He gets to set off the plot, whatever. Then the minions, who would usually rush and block the doorway, I put last. That lets the players get into the room. It lets them interact with the evil altar and the boiling cauldron, which are cool story elements within the combat. Then understand how grid combat, if you're using a battle mat and minis, interacts with the theater of the mind method where you're just talking through what happens. Because those are 2 different types of stories that you're going to tell based on what you're using. The grid-based combat is going to be all about that gritty, mechanical, I have to aim my spell just right. Whereas the theater of the mind is going to be, I shoot my fireball in and orcs go flying everywhere. If you use theater of the mind And a lot of us have used it in like first and second edition or other games, but then third and fourth edition of D&D really focused on grids. So getting back into theater of the mind takes practice. What you need to remember is theater of the mind is a different game, and if you start trying to focus on distances and really mechanical things while you're still not using a map, all you're doing is actually slowing the game down. Because people are just going to keep asking, how far away am I? How many can I get in the fireball? So you have to train them to think about it as a story in a book, not as a game on a map. So that is what I had to say. Let's take some things away from here. D&D is a game. There's no denying it. But it is also a means to tell a story. Do not be afraid of the story that you're telling. Don't be afraid of changing the rules of the game a little bit to tell a better story that the players want to interact with. You cannot break D&D. It's been around since 1974. You doing something wrong, they're not going to rush in and steal your books. Take them away. Be a fan of the characters. Help them tell the story they want to tell. Don't be afraid to let the players take control of the story when it makes sense or when it would make the story better.